Thank you very much for coming to the Housing Forum our report on gentrification in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Before we get into that, I want to very quickly note that this is the 50th anniversary of CURA. As part of our year-long celebration, we're going to sponsor a speaker series. And I want to say something very quickly about that. The first event in the speaker series is Friday, March 30th. And I will be talking at that event about the contents of a book that is about to be released by Cornell University Press. And it's called The One-Way Street of Integration. And so we'll be talking about integration and community development as different strategies for achieving racial and regional equity. That's on March 30th. The second event in the series is Wednesday, May 9th. We will have Professor Lisa Bates from Portland State University in town to talk about regional equity. Lisa Bates is one of the scholars whose work on gentrification we used in our work today. On Friday, September 14th, Professor Tommy Shelby from Harvard will be in town, and he'll talk about cultural pluralism, integration, and racial justice. And then finally in October, and we don't have an exact date yet, and we don't have all of our speakers lined up yet, but we do have a topic, and the topic will be the 1967 Plymouth Avenue rebellion, unrest, riot, choose your word. And we envision a panel of speakers to talk about that. We wanted to highlight that because that was one of the important events in the creation of CURA, actually. It was that point in time that the University of Minnesota apparently first realized it was located in a major metropolitan area, and that it should have a unit that was really focused on research and outreach and interactions with the community. So we wanted to have a retrospective of that as well. So look for further information about that. You're all on our mailing list, and you'll get more information about that. So today, then, we want to talk about our gentrification study, which we first talked about many months ago, and so we're finally at a point where we can provide you with our full set of findings. And so I will talk briefly to introduce the project, and then we'll provide you with our findings. Gentrification is, of course, a very loaded political word and phenomenon. Some people see it as the end of community, as the end of affordability, as disruptive changes to communities. Other people see gentrification as the much-needed investment that lower income and disinvested communities have been hoping for years and years. And so it generates a lot of interest, as shown by the fact that all of the chairs in the room are full. We went into this research without any preconceptions about whether it was happening or not, and that, I think, shows in our methodology. We used the approach of three nationally known researchers. We used their definition of gentrification, and we simply applied them to the Minneapolis and St. Paul data to see whether their sense of gentrification was actually being reflected in what is happening in the two central cities. Tony will tell you more about our methods there. We followed up that quantitative analysis with qualitative interviews to see whether the people who live and work and do business in the communities had perceptions about neighborhood change that matched or didn't match what we were seeing with the data. And so that's the qualitative part of our analysis as well. And Dr. Brittany Lewis will take us through the findings of that as well. So it's a mixed methods approach. Our time period for the study is the year 2000 to 2015 for the quantitative analysis, but 2017 for the qualitative interviews as well. So that's our time frame, and I'll invite Tony up to take you through the methods.
All right, thank you very much, Ed. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tony Damiano. I'm a research assistant at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, and I'm also a PhD candidate at the Humphrey School. So I'm just going to talk relatively briefly about our methods and what are we thinking about when we're trying to measure gentrification in a systematic, quantitative way. So first, it's obviously very difficult to define gentrification. Oftentimes it's, people say, you know, it's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. But of course that doesn't cut it for quantitative research. So we need to think of a way to describe kind of the logic model of what's happening. So when we're talking about gentrification, it's really a two-step process. So first, we start at the beginning of our time period, which in this case is the year 2000, and asks, which tracts are able to gentrify, right? Any census tract or neighborhood can experience upgrading or decline, but when we're talking about gentrification, we're talking specifically about upgrading in previously lower income neighborhoods. So the first step is to just take out neighborhoods that were higher income in 2000, and we just discard those for our analysis. The second step is once we've identified tracts that could gentrify, did the changes that took place in that tract between the beginning and end of our study periods, in our case between 2000 and 2015, do those changes constitute gentrification or not? And then some tracts, of course, did gentrify and some tracts did not. So using the three scholarly papers that Ed mentioned, as well as sort of a broad understanding within quantitative gentrification research, how do we go about trying to define gentrification and gentrifiability? So in the first case, when we talk generally about low-income neighborhoods, we mean neighborhoods that are largely populated by low-income households and neighborhoods that have previously experienced disinvestment. Then when we're talking about gentrification, we're talking about a change in trajectory. These previously low-income, disinvested neighborhoods start to see a change in their trajectory. They see an influx of relatively affluent gentry, which is usually means an influx of college-educated population, and also an increase in investment, which is usually measured in increasing home values and increasing rents. Another factor that often comes up in the gentrification conversation is displacement. What is displacement? Does there have to be some form of displacement in order for gentrification to have taken place or not? So first, it's important to point out that there are many forms of displacement. Often in quantitative research or in popular media, we hear just about the top one, last resident displacement. That's the classic form of displacement that you think of when you think of gentrification. Rising rents, economic evictions of lower income populations who used to be able to afford that housing. However, there are many other important types of displacement that can be much harder to measure. The first is, I'll talk about exclusionary displacement. So this happens in previously low-income neighborhoods where we see rising housing costs, and this results in a loss of affordability, and it limits the housing choice of low-income households, as this was a neighborhood that they used to be able to afford and now are no longer able to move in to the neighborhood. And the last one on this list is cultural displacement and displacement pressure. So maybe your family is able to stay, but your housing cost burden, you go from paying 20% of your income on housing costs to 40% of your income on housing costs over time. This results in displacement pressure, and also can happen as the neighborhood changes around you. So again, maybe you are able to stay, but as maybe family or friends are displaced, or the businesses change, the way the neighborhood is policed changes, and so your own neighborhood can start to feel alienating or like you don't belong. So this is an important, we believe a very important part of the displacement conversation as well. And so talking about this displacement, we believe it's very important, but it is also very difficult to measure. There are some studies that try to get at this phenomenon, but it requires very specialized data sets, and even then, that still only accounts for the first type of displacement, right? It is only able to measure this kind of last resident displacement. And even then, there are still problems with this. It's also very difficult to distinguish sometimes between what is a voluntary or involuntary move, right? If displacement, I'll give an example. So let's say a couple decides they have a child. They have a one-bedroom apartment right now. They would like to stay in the neighborhood but upgrade to a larger two-bedroom apartment. They're unable to afford that two-bedroom apartment in their current neighborhood and are forced to move to a different neighborhood. Does that fall under the category of voluntary or involuntary displacement? So it can get pretty messy once we get down to that. And so as I mentioned previously, that this also only gets at this last resident displacement and is not able to capture the other types of displacement. And so unfortunately, we're not able to systematically measure displacement in our study, but we hope that the qualitative analysis at least gives a sense of how neighborhoods are understanding that change and can maybe hint at the types of displacement that are happening, but it's difficult for us to make any systematic claims about that. We can talk about exclusionary displacement. So if you look at these maps here, this is looking at how different racial and ethnic groups, how typical renters from those different groups, which neighborhoods are affordable to them. So this top line is in the year 2000. We see neighborhoods that are affordable for the typical black renter household, typical Hispanic rental household, typical white renter household. So we see differences in the neighborhoods that are affordable, with the typical African American family being able to afford fewer neighborhoods due to having lower incomes. But this can change over time. So now we jump to 2014 and we see a loss of affordability for white households due to rising rents and stagnant incomes, similarly with Hispanic and Latino households. And then we see this extreme pattern here where not a single neighborhood is affordable to the typical black renter household. So we believe that this type of exclusionary displacement is definitely a reality already here in Minneapolis. All right. So just a little bit more about our quantitative analysis. As I mentioned, we used 3 gentrification indices. They measure gentrification slightly differently, but they all contain similar types of variables: Freeman, Ding, and Bates. One other thing I would like to talk about is that we believe that our measurement of gentrification is on the conservative side for several reasons. The first of which is when we talk about change that constitutes gentrification, we mean changes happening in census tracts that are more extreme than what's happening in the city as a whole. So not just rising home values in a census tract, but rising faster than the city as a whole. And this is more conservative than using the region, for example, because the changes happening in our central cities in terms of home values and college-educated population are much more extreme than what are happening in the region as a whole. So, for example, we have Minneapolis. During our study period, Minneapolis saw a 26.7% increase in its college-educated population. The region as a whole only saw a 20% increase. Home values in Minneapolis went up 23%. Home values in the region only went up 7%. We see a similar pattern between St. Paul and the region as a whole, except slightly less extreme. 22% increase, higher than the region. Home values increasing higher than the region, and rents increasing slightly more than the region as a whole. Another reason we believe that this is an understatement or a conservative understanding of gentrification is due to the nature of the data. So the data that we're using for our end period comes from the 2011 to 2015 American Community Survey, which, first of all, the end year is 2015. So we've had 2 years since 2015 of housing prices and rents growing at a good clip. So our quantitative analysis is unable to capture these changes. The last point I want to make about the sort of lagging nature of this data is that it's a survey over a 5-year period, right? So the first year of this study is 2011, which is still in the trough of the Great Recession. So the data that we are using is tempered because look at the difference here between the end and the beginning of the study period. And so all of this is sort of averaged together. So we're missing the most recent changes that have been in home values and rents that have been going up at a good clip. So that's how we've worked to define gentrification and our study for the quantitative paper. And so I will pass this over back to Ed, who will talk about the results of the quantitative analysis.
Thank you, Tony. I think another reason why we consider our measurement of gentrification to be conservative is because we use these 3 different measures and we looked for where they agreed. So where at least 2 of the 3 indices that we used agreed that gentrification is occurring, that's where we have identified it as occurring. So we're looking for overlap between these. And so here you have a map of the 2 central cities on the issue of gentrifiability, all right? So the red colored census tracts are those that the Bates index indicates are gentrifiable. The Dean index, and you can see it's quite different and a little more inclusive. Sorry, that was Freeman, and the Bates here. And so what we did was to create, combine all 3 of them, and then to consider gentrifiable those census tracts where at least 2 of the 3 indices agreed. All right, and so that provides us with this map, which we call the consensus gentrifiable areas in the year 2000. Right, gentrifiability is the beginning state here. So we looked at it in 2000. Right. So you can see, again, large portions of North Minneapolis, Northeast, near South, and then this broad central area of St. Paul, portions of the east side, the west side, and this tract down West 7th. And so then these became our study tracts. And what we did then was to apply the definitions, again, the 3 definitions of gentrification to these tracts to see which of these tracts the indices identified as gentrifying. And so again, now in blue, the dark blue indicates a census tract that each of the indices identified as gentrifying. The light blue are gentrifiable, but did not gentrify. All right, so again, we see Freeman Freeman's index here, Bates's index, and Ding's index, and here is the overlap. All right. So this is the map of the 2 central cities where we have identified through these indices that gentrification is occurring. So what you see behind you then, the dark blue census tracts are the ones that at least 2 of the indices have identified as gentrifying. This gives us 27 census tracts in the 2 central cities. About 1/3 of all of the gentrifiable census tracts actually did gentrify according to these indices between 2000 and 2015. And you can see that 21 of those tracts are in Minneapolis and 6 of those tracts are in St. Paul. Doesn't look like 6, but that's because there are 3 separate tracts in the Frogtown area that clump together in one cluster, etc. So this is our map of gentrification. And so what we then, before I go any further, there are a couple of interesting outliers here. The first one is the Sumner-Glenwood area. This, of course, is the location of the Heritage Park redevelopment. So in the year 2000, they were in the middle of the redevelopment process, and so you see tremendous changes in this area simply because of the size and the scale of that redevelopment that was taking place. This is the university area near Dinkytown, and this is an area that has seen a significant amount of housing developed over the last 6 or 7 years. It has, and what has that done? That has housed a lot of students, and students end up showing up in income categories as in the poverty section. So this one census tract jumped from 35 or 40% poverty to 77% poverty during this period of time. It's not the typical increase in poverty, and so we wanted to sort of highlight that. And the last one that jumps out is this tract just south of the new Vikings Death Star. That stadium is called. And there's and apparently there was some new housing built there. The median income or the median value of the housing, however, in that census tract dropped from over 850,000. This is a median value of 850,000 to about 250,000. So it was a huge drop. However, that 250,000 in home value in 2015 still makes it the highest value of all of our gentrifying tracts. The tract went from 2% ownership to about 30% ownership. So there was something going on, some significant development, but at although a high level, not as astronomically high as the little bit of housing that had existed there before. So these 3 we regard as outliers. And then we took a look at in sort of a summary way of what happened to those gentrifying census tracts. And so there's a couple of really interesting patterns here. This is, of course, in the percent black, percent below poverty, median income, 2000 and 2015, and it compares the gentrifying neighborhoods with those that were gentrifiable but did not gentrify, okay? And what you'll see is not a lot of change in percent black. And in fact, if you look at percent people of color, percent white, there's also not a great deal of racial change in the gentrifying neighborhoods or the other ones. You'll also note actually that poverty actually increased on average in our gentrifying census tracts. It was a 4 percentage point increase, less than 4, whereas poverty in the gentrifiable neighborhoods increased twice that rate. But still, we see an increase overall. And then you'll see that in constant dollars, incomes were actually lower in 2015. Now, if you recall that graph that Tony showed you about the trough in home prices during our study period, well, incomes usually lag the recovery of home prices. So if you were to imagine that graph for incomes and not the home prices that Tony did, the trough would be actually closer to the middle of our 5-year ACS period, and that might account for some of these patterns. But still, this seems a little bit counterintuitive. Here are the set of changes that are a little bit more in line with what we would expect. Rising rents that were much higher, double the rate that you saw in these neighborhoods. $50,000 on average in increase in median home value compared to almost no change in the non-gentrifying. And then a significant increase in the percent of the population with college degrees. Now, those who research gentrification usually indicate that there are a number of ways of measuring socioeconomic status. Most of them actually prefer the education variable because it doesn't vary as much from year to year as income does over time. And so some people regard the education variable as more important. But point being that we've got some things going on here that are sort of counterintuitive. And our quick answer to this is that we saw lots of variation across our gentrifying tracts, all right? So we saw, for example, in Highland Park, there in southwest St. Paul, a 25% increase in the black population. In the Bottineau area, a 12% increase. In Willard Hay, we saw a 22% decline in one of the census tracts over there. And in the Bryant neighborhood, a 1/3 decline, or a 33 percentage point decline, slightly different. So wildly sort of different experiences on percent black. You can say the same thing about percent poverty. Increases in poverty of double digits in some places, but also double-digit declines in some of our other neighborhoods as well. And the median income increases and declines, right? So lots of variation in what's happening, and all of those, that previous slide that I showed you was simply an average of all of these. And so there are really different realities taking place. We also, I think, see variation within gentrifying census tracts. So you can find census tracts that show tremendous increase in college educated population, but a decline in median household income, or changes in home value, but increases in, or rather declines in home value, increases in white populations. There seem to be sort of contradictory things taking place within census tracts as well. And so what we tried to do, one of the things that may be going on here is, of course, the arbitrariness of census boundaries, right? And so this is an example. The Hamlin Midway census tract right here is one that we identified as gentrifying. But when we did interviews in the neighborhood, we found that most of the people referred to changes taking place with the new soccer stadium and the changes along University Avenue that weren't actually in the census tract, but produced changes. What the hell was that? Produced changes that showed up in the census tract. So you can see that what happens in a census tract doesn't necessarily have to be uniform across all of the blocks of that census tract, and it would be sort of unusual if it was as well. All right, so uniform patterns across the census tracts. All of our census tracts showed large increases in education level. Most all of them showed large increases in home values, and most of them showed increases in rents. And the correlation between the increase in rents was positive with the increase in the number of renters. That is, where the number of renters increased, we also saw the largest increases in the rent levels as well. So what we did then was what we call a principal component analysis. All these different things taking place in census tracts, we let the computer sort of sift the data, and we came up with 4 overall patterns of change in these census tracts, all right? 2 of them conform to what we would regard as classic gentrification, all right? There was rising housing costs, rising socioeconomic status in terms of education, incomes were rising as well, and in one of the variants of our classic, there was a declining black population, so there was some racial change taking place as well. But there was a second variation on the classic, which is, again, rising housing costs, rising SES, rising incomes, and no racial change at all. And this shows you the number of census tracts in each of those categories. And then there was 2 more patterns where we saw gentrification, but we also saw increasing poverty in those census tracts as well. And again, there were 2 variants there. One with no change in the black population, and then a second one where there was a change in the black population. In this case, it was an increase. In this case, incomes were declining and poverty was increasing, but you still had significant increases in housing costs and socioeconomic change overall. So we've identified across these 27 census tracts 4 different ways that these neighborhoods were gentrifying, and so we can map that then, and we have in the following. So the classic cases are in the light and dark shade of blue. So the dark blue is the classic change with a declining black population, and we see that in Willard Hay, we see it in Central, and then the second set of patterns with the increase in poverty we see in the different shades of red, all right? And so you see these patterns taking place. So in order to try to get a handle on what was going on, and also to check about resident perceptions and about the perceptions of people who live in these neighborhoods, we undertook qualitative interviews, and I will hand it to Brittany Lewis to walk you through these.
I am Dr. Brittany Lewis, as Ed gets kindly introduced me as. I'm a research associate at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs. I'm in charge of our qualitative research projects in gentrification, evictions, and work on policing. Okay. I'm going to go through some of our findings in the qualitative research. I'll note 2 things. I cannot possibly tell you the full extent of all the interviews that we have done. I'm strategically choosing things. I won't possibly be able to read and analyze every quote that are on the screen. All these slides are online and live right now, so you can go back and do that yourself. There's also a web page that has the full written up analysis of each cluster area for you to read, in addition to some responses from community members within those 5 clusters that provide kind of nuanced neighborhood leadership analysis of the things that we found. Okay. All right. I think it's really important for you all to get a sense of why of the qualitative research and the value of it. So we developed our qualitative research team to demonstrate the following. 1, the value of shared meaning making with local community members experiencing the day-to-day realities of urban restructuring. That is important. Understand the importance of showing a dynamic and negotiated set of realities, giving individuals the chance to share how they feel or live a reality instead of relying solely on quantitative data analysis, which assumes a fixed and measurable reality by aiming to control for anomalies or difference. And the last thing, a deeper understanding of why and how major development and decisions impacts people the way it does, especially consider that there is an unsaid social and psychological distancing that often takes place between those making decisions and those everyday people most affected by the change, as they are trying to understand what is happening to them or with them at the table. That's why qualitative research is very important. So as a community-engaged researcher and trained urban ethnographer, I not only value the meaningful involvement of our community-based partner in the development of our research project, but I'm particularly attuned to the importance of bringing those voices that exist on the margins of our dominant discourses to the center. So we value mainstream knowledges as much as experiential, cultural, and spiritual knowledges. So in doing so, we embrace a vision that does not shy away from results that produce a narrative that is uncomfortable to grapple with, but value those insights as the center of where change is created about those things that we've come to accept as the mainstream. So what is situated knowledge? So the debate surrounding gentrification is a nuanced one with competing and converging understandings of experience. So our qualitative research approach invited community members to embrace what their situated knowledges and their experiential knowledges tell them about what community redevelopment values are guiding the changes they are seeing around them and what impact it has had or will have on their lives. Knowledge is subjective. What does that mean? In short, it means it refers to feelings and experiences that depend on individuals' particular viewpoints and identities, right? Our various categories of identity influence the type of knowledge claims that we might make or feel privileged to make. The context of understanding any one event or phenomenon is always shifting from our own respective realities or where we stand as we interact with the world, which means our positionality is relational, right? It's always already relational. There's another graphic just to help folks kind of understand what I'm talking about. I'm also talking about our social location, where we stand in the world, how we individually see and experience the world, and how the world engages back with us is determined by the ways our various identity characteristics intersect with the social, political, and economic world. This is a relational process, okay? All right. So when deciding which cluster areas that we actually do interviews in, first we had to understand what our central goals were in actually doing these interviews, okay? The first goal is to assess whether or not our quantitative indices of gentrification match resident perception, okay? And the second goal was to analyze how local residents from a broad range of demographics, homeowners, business owners, renters, and long-term residents are defining, experiencing, and identifying the slow processing of a gentrifying neighborhood. All right, so here's a map of the 5 study areas that we chose, and here is on the left side of the process in which we use to identify the areas that we would actually do interviews. So we cross-analyzed both our quantitative indexes and our initial interviews with local officials and neighborhood leaders. We excluded those neighborhoods that identified from the quantitative indexes that highlighted a small or portion of a larger neighborhood, not adjacent or within historic low-income communities, so they got pushed out. And the last thing that we did, we wanted to integrate the initial interviews with public officials and local leaders that did not fall in line. So we only ended up adding one neighborhood that did not fall in line with our original analyses, solely because so many of our public officials, neighborhood leaders were identifying trends that matched the work our quantitative indexes identify, i.e. how folks experience it matters just as much as what the maps show us, okay? Okay, so just to give you a sense of our method, we use snowball sampling to recruit local residents for semi-structured one-on-one interviews. Our residential stakeholders are equally distributed amongst these groups, as you can see: homeowners, business owners, renters, and long-term residents. We completed 58 interviews with local residents, which did not include the additional 30 interviews we did with local officials and neighborhood leaders in those tracks. So in the end, a total of 88 employees. Okay. So the first thing that I will do is look at the narrative commonalities across the 5 clusters. They're representative of our classic discourses of gentrification that most of us are used to hearing. For that purpose, I'll simply provide you a composite data on the frequent use of these common narrative frames and select a few quotes to read aloud to illustrate in what terms those we interviewed describe those frames. And after, I'll spend a bit more energy on the narrative distinctions within those 5 frames. Rapidly increasing rents and home values. 100% of our participants identified increasing financial costs as well as concerns over affordability as an indicator of neighborhood change that they were experiencing. A quote that can help illustrate this. Quote, if I look at my customers, you used to be able to get 1 or 2 bedroom apartment here for $850 or a duplex, or now you're probably looking at $1,600 to $2,200. The average new build condo studio is 11, referencing to 1,100, and a double is probably 2,200. That is absolutely insane. Changes in demographics by race, income, and age. 88% of our participants identified an increase of whiteness in their community, and 53% used this synonymously with higher incomes and more professionals. 67% identified that a younger population is moving into the community. A quote to illustrate this. So as much as I like to see good white people running around and enjoying their community, you know what I'm saying, enjoying their amenities, those amenities should not come with those people. Yeah. And one of my favorites. And there's displacement fears. So and as our quantitative scholars noted to us before, it's extremely challenging to measure displacement, but we can talk about the ways in which we talk about and experience the fear of displacement. 67% of our respondents noted a fear of physical displacement by citing the inevitability of displacement, being pushed out, priced out for the area, or becoming no longer affordable. My main concern is affordable housing, because we don't have affordable housing. We're going to eventually be pushed out, all people of color, not just black people, everybody, or black people, period. A new commercial development, 67% of our participants identified new businesses or business development uncharacteristic of the neighborhood as a sign of gentrification. And I'm gonna kind of push forward here a little bit. So the first neighborhood cluster that I'll talk a little bit about is North. The story of gentrification that emerges from our interviews in North Minneapolis highlights questions about access, ownership, race, political power, and belonging. Respondents expressed fear that newer residents were in a place to dictate and often spur rapid residential and commercial change, creating feelings of isolation, disposability, and doubt in the hearts and minds of those low-income and long-term residents who have endured decades of municipal neglect and public and private disinvestment. So some of the unique frames that came out of our interviews in North were of the 3. A lack of community-based ownership was often a narrative frame used, or that came out of our interviews. The quote, new wave of development neglects resident voices, and quote, historic designations being used as a tool for gentrification. One long-term resident of color stated, one thing that I noticed when having a community meeting, people will stand up and say, my name is blank, and I'm a 4th generation Homewood resident. They're always citing their relationship to the community and their longevity, because these people have been living here and been having to deal with people coming in and telling them all the time, what is the new wave? And they're asserting, well, I've been through all these waves, and you're still not going to tell me, or I still don't appreciate this. This sentiment was shared by a long-term white resident as well, when describing the messaging that he sends to the new white families that move into the area, quote, move here if you want to be a part of the neighborhood, but don't move here if you want to make this neighborhood into where you came from. If you just want to change the neighborhood, hopefully you move here for the people, not just for the housing stock. Move here to be a part of the community. Yeah. Another really important indicator that popped out was this question of historic designation as a sign of gentrification. Well-intentioned approaches to community change can have unforeseen consequences, particularly for those who typically lack economic and political power. Historic designation has the potential to prevent the creation of many mansions and to preserve historic housing stock. Yet, it also has the potential to create a neighborhood that can only be maintained by those with the capital to invest in the historic restoration of their homes, So in this case, 80% of our residents interviewed argued that a small number of politically empowered residents were able to use historic preservation as a tool of gentrification. They maintained that it was negligent to only see improvement and upgrading without the potential for involuntary displacement. I'm gonna move on to Northeast. The consequences of creative placemaking for Northeast Minneapolis has shown uneven effects because of the rise of a new population of empty nesters and young professionals and long-term residents, business stakeholders, and artists. Our interview participants described the rise of an art-making class has the ability to mass-produce their work unlike others before them, that fulfills the consumption patterns of a new affluent class of residents, tourists, and hipsters, and the defining outcome of a gentrified Northeast. The rise of a new creative class has ushered in dramatic changes in housing and rental costs, while leaving many unsure of their ability to remain in the community, and for others are forced to seek live-work art space elsewhere. So some of the things that came out that were unique about our New York interviews, the commodification of the arts was always already connected to this event called Art World, the beer and the band. Creative placemaking brings new types of artistic makers. I thought this was super interesting and compelling. Brewers, I guess brewers are makers now, right? And they're talking about their art and their art form. And there's a lot of tech and design companies that are coming in and renting and finding space in Northeast and benefiting from this economy. And the last thing that came out, the raw artist is unable to afford live-work space, and they're being forced to the inner and outer ring suburbs, where at one point they flocked to Northeast to gain those lower income spaces. All right, so as I noted before, the most frequently cited factor for a gentrified Northeast among our stakeholders was the expansion and commercialization of Art World. Art World is an open studio art tour which began with 12 artists in 1996 with limited attendees, and has now grown to over 600 artists with 30,000 attendees from across the state and country, attending not only for the artists but also for the beer and the dance. One of our artists stated, "We, the artists that fuel the creative economy, are larger than sports. We are larger than almost all other industries, and our impact is in the billions of dollars because the breweries are selling the beer because the artists are here." So what happens as gentrification comes in and changes the fabric of a neighborhood? It also starts to drive up an economic powerhouse that services that changing dynamic. And another interesting quote, "Now it's more like Mardi Gras than any kind of fine arts event." This quote just talks a little bit more about this maker idea, but I'm not gonna spend a great deal of time on that. In our South Minneapolis cluster, when community stakeholders in our South Minneapolis cluster reflected on the neighborhood changes that they were experiencing, they described their fear of the uptowning of their neighborhoods. An obvious reference to uptown, the uptown area of South Minneapolis near Lake Calhoun, which was once mostly small businesses with an ethnic flair, which now features places like Apple Store, Victoria's Secret, and Urban Outfitters. These residents had turned uptown into a verb and associated the uptowning of their neighborhoods with developers and city officials moving away from supporting small mom and pop shops and the building of affordable housing to rapidly developing denser market rate housing, increasing property values, the rise of new high-end specialty shops, and a continued disinvestment in historic businesses of color and community-driven enterprises. So here's the three frames that I think that came out for us. The fear of uptowning that were unique, I would say. New businesses not matching historic resident needs, and a lack of resources for established community-driven businesses. One stakeholder states, now on the corner there's a $20 candle store across from Pillsbury House. And so it's an interesting kind of hipster mix. And I'm not 100% sure how I feel about it. Like, I'm a little bit concerned we're going the way of uptown and what that means as far as the people that's going to bring into the neighborhood that's going to shop here. It's not only the frequent phone calls from outsiders asking if they are interested in selling their buildings, but the presence of businesses non-characteristic of the neighborhood showing up, like the candle shop, that leaves not only residents anxious about what type of new business patrons will come, but if the tastes and the desires of those residents that are committed to staying in the area will be reflected in those impending changes. One stakeholder stated, The Blue Ox, when they first moved in, trying to do something different in the neighborhood, and I tried to talk to the owner at the time of the Blue Ox to let them know things to draw the neighborhood in, the people that had been here forever. And they really didn't buy into that. And they didn't last very long because their product and the area and what people used to and the price. So that business is no longer being bought and is now a different coffee shop. All right. Hamlin Midway. Similar to many residents across the 5 cluster neighborhoods, Hamlin Midway community stakeholders are noticing a visible change in their neighborhood's residential demographics, commercial business development, as well as increasing housing prices that some, not all, fear will displace those families that once sought out the area for its affordability. You know, I argue that amongst all the cluster areas we did interviews, and there was the most discontent amongst our interviews in this area. But unlike any other interviews across the 5 clusters, residents in Hamlin Midway have competing perceptions of the realities of crime and safety that are making some feel like a part of the problem and others a part of the solution. I found that to be really interesting to hear. So popular wisdom surrounding gentrification often focuses on the results of economic restructuring while neglecting what happens to low-income neighborhoods once they receive an influx of new affluent class of residents, the social dynamics. Even the rules of civility change. Areas that are going through changes in economics will often draw more police, which create conditions for more surveillance, and increase concerns about public safety and public order. Among the community stakeholders that we interviewed, there was considerable disagreement between low-income residents of color and racially and ethnic minorities in general, and a growing population of young, educated interviewees, a majority who are white, about the realities of crime and surveillance in the area. One of our long-term residents of color stated, "I think another indication that I noticed, and this is kind of cyclical in our neighborhood, but there always seems to be this uptick in concern about crime that happens in our conversations. And what has happened in the recent couple of years, there's been a lot of concern about youth congregating in our neighborhood or quality of life issues along University Avenue. And I feel like it kind of, as the neighborhood becomes more attractive to certain people, that conversation has started. And although crime in Ward 4, which encompasses Hamlin Midway, went down overall last year, there have reportedly been more police phone calls in Hamlin Midway. The quote, the theory goes that a demographic shift, activity that was previously considered normal, becomes suspicious, and newcomers, many of whom are white, are more inclined to get law enforcement involved. This heightened level of awareness is often coincide with a large number of 311 and 911 calls focused on quality of life crimes, increasing the presence of police officers on the street. This does not and should not suggest that people should not call the police or condone criminal behavior. It highlights the ways that gentrification impact goes far beyond physical built environment and rising housing costs. So as Hamlin Midway begins to see once vacant commercial buildings no longer vacant, along Stelling and University, the Midway Shopping Center torn down, and the building of a new soccer stadium moved forward, full head of stream. Some stakeholders argue that little engagement has happened with the low-income population that actually relied on Midway, and are developing relationships there. So the neighborhood is going to, experience the lasting effects of this work. I think Hamlin Midway, there's a lot happening around this area that's going to impact a great deal of how folks are experiencing space and place in Hamlin Midway. I'm gonna skip over some of the statement stuff because of time. The last cluster area that we focused on was Frogtown. When our community stakeholders interviewed in Frogtown, Thomasdale neighborhood reflected on neighborhood changes they have experienced. They often describe the ways that increasing home and area demographics have come to impact affordability for renters and homeowners alike, as well as change the face of its residents and its businesses. Many argue that the touting of a new affordable housing development in their community is no longer met with open arms. They know all too well that those residents living in the area cannot afford those units, even at the lowest rate of 30% area median income, because the addition of wealthier communities in the calculation for median income skews the numbers, making, quote, affordable units unattainable for those most in need. So as the quote States, I mean, on one hand, there's a lot of development, and it's a type. It's a tax credit, affordable housing, retail on the bottom, 2 or 3 stories of what's termed affordable housing up. The oddity that is that with the affordable housing is the qualifiers are often for people who make more money than the people who actually live here. Another thing that came up, it sounds like there's these survival strategies, I call them, for folks living in this reality. This doubling up kept coming up. And in short, that means, folks that probably aren't on the lease or shouldn't be living there are moving in to help ends meet. Homeowners are becoming renters because they can't afford to sell, but they gotta make money. And or there are folks that actually reported asking, I have no idea who lives in that house, but the turnover in there is rampant, right? So folks talk a lot about how folks are surviving those realities. But I want to say something a bit more about what's happening with the housing costs and affordable housing being built in the area. So new affordable housing apartments built with state and federal housing tax credits are based on area median income of the region, which according to HUD was set at about $90,000 in 2017. Yet the local AMI for Frogtown was about $35,000. Additionally, affordable housing units often come with the requirements of higher credit scores, caps on the number of tenants per bedroom, and stringent background checks for all potential tenants, all of which makes the new affordable housing developments not only unaffordable for historic residents, but often inaccessible. Our community stakeholders continue to share stories from their own lives or from their close family and friends that indicate that many are struggling to maintain housing in the Frogtown area, as they acknowledge their experiences of rising rents among the persistence of subpar living conditions, the inaccessibility of the new affordable housing complexes, and a breadth of landlords willing to accept Section 8. They also described how many people are finding ways to maintain residency. And I use the doubling up example. 60% of Frogtown's renting households are cost burdened and are simply trying to hold their housing in the market where naturally affordable housing options are dwindling. As a result, our community stakeholders are reporting that they are forced to develop alternative survival tactics to remain residencies in the area. So the last thing I will say about what the qualitative found, the ethics of the work that we were doing, the qualitative analysis of our study can help us unmask the material and ideological effects of urban redevelopment, not as numerical abstraction, okay? But through a very real set of social, political, and economic realities grounded in daily life. I have a number of other really powerful stories I would love to share with you all, but people are, in a very material way, struggling with kind of what they're being impacted by. Only other thing I'll note, we don't look like New York. We don't look like San Francisco, right? And these changes will look different in this space based on its history, its structure, etc. But I would argue we have to ask the question, do our quantitative maps match resident perception? I would say yes, in many ways they do. I would say something I'm deeply interested in as a scholar is this lack of attention to the question of belonging and fear in the study of gentrification. We don't talk enough about those non-infrastructural things when we talk about change. Many policymakers say, well, you have to show me in how it's affecting the structure itself. I'm not really caring about how people are living and feeling, and I think that matters just as much. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yes.